from Malaysia. And we also have Homaira Zamiri. Sister Homaira is one of the founder and initiator of Jakarta Bersatu project from Indonesia. And for the moderator will be Mr. Temba Lewis from Borderless 360s. And that being said, I will over to you, Temba, to take it away. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Zico, and thank you all for being here. I'm sure that people will let us know if you have trouble hearing or you have any kind of an issue with Zoom or the technologies that you're using. We have people that might be able to help you out. And for those of you who've been waiting in the waiting room, thank you for your patience as we work on some of the technological background issues that we would hope by this far into the pandemic we'd have advanced from. But one of the truisms about internet technology is that there's always going to be some issue along the way. One of the benefits is certainly that we can convene a meeting like this, the second panel session of the Forced Displacement and Urban Management Conference 2021, focused on moving beyond resettlement. And we have a great group of panelists, we have a great group of participants, and I hope we can have a really good discussion today about how we see movement around advocacy for and with refugees going forward now and into the future. Just a few words about myself and about how we're going to progress. My name is Temba Lewis. I am the co-lead of Borderless 360, which is a very new and fledgling entity out of Singapore, working on non-traditional avenues of refugee advocacy. I'm also a trustee of Amira International, working to promote refugee legal aid around the world. I've been working with refugees for a number of years and across a number of contexts, and I know a lot of you, which is one of the benefits of this type of work, is that you run into so many good people. As Zico mentioned, we have Naima, Homaira, and Tristan as our panelists today. I won't take specific time to ask them to introduce themselves now, but I will have them say a few words about themselves as they answer some of the questions that I'm going to be putting forward. This panel is designed to perform sort of like a talk show in a sense. It's really an opportunity to play a couple of questions across the panel and see what comes out of that and what kind of discussion comes out of that. And so I've been provided a couple of talking points that I will be using to loosely direct the conversation, but we'll certainly welcome any comments or questions that come in from the participants or from the panelists themselves over the course of the discussion, so that we can be sure that that there's a diversity of input into what this conversation will look like. So without further ado, thank you all again. I'll start with talking point number one, which is addressing the elephant in the room, which is this situation of sustained, prolonged, intractable displacement that we see not only across Southeast Asia, but across much of the globe. And this elephant in the room is really the reason behind this, the discussion beyond resettlement. What are the options for people who do end up in these situations, rightsless, and oftentimes in the shadows, in hostile legal environments, and struggling for basic livelihoods, and what are the options that we have to move these situations forward in a positive way. For a number of reasons, and I'll just intro each of these talking points before I move to the panelists, but for a number of reasons, much more attention gets paid to the immediate response to refugee situations. The media, international politics, humanitarian relief, all of these converge around a refugee exodus. And you see it on the news and you read about it, but then these things fade. And you can look at situations like Rwanda, you could look at situations like Cote d'Ivoire, Somalia, Syria, and even Myanmar to an extent as examples of this. And new influxes tend to receive the bulk of humanitarian assistance, media attention, and international charity. But each of these new spotlights, as they come into focus, tend to draw that light away from other circumstances and other situations that make really effectively responding to refugee crises very difficult, because a response is not just to an initial influx of refugees, but to that whole process. You're dedicating yourself to a process of finding solutions to the situation that refugees are in. Of course, refugees themselves are the first responders and the last ones on the ground, as they will tell you, in all of these situations. So when that spotlight shifts, they do not. They stay in those circumstances and try to build what they can in terms of sustainable livelihoods and futures. So we have refugees and non-refugee participants on our panel today. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts about how these protracted refugee situations affect refugees that are experiencing them, and how the dynamic of refugees living without durable solutions over decades affects not only the enjoyment of fundamental rights, which it certainly does, but also the relationships with hosting countries and the opportunities for return and integration and resettlement. I'd like to start with Naima, if your connection is strong. Working in Malaysia with communities that have faced multiple generations of displacement and are forced to try to survive in an environment that lacks fundamental access to rights and any number of other livelihood supports. Can you comment on how the duration of life in exile affects the refugee community members that you work with? And maybe in your answer, you can give a little bit of an introduction to what you do as well.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Naima Ismail. I am a refugee women's rights activist from Somalia and currently lives in Malaysia as a refugee. I am a public health graduate and I'm challenging health inequities, including gender discrimination. I'm a founder and director of Somali Women's Association of Malaysia. I'm a healthy education trainer for the Somali refugee community and a focal point of refugee women and girls, key to the global compact of refugees. I've experienced in working with women on issues about health, trauma, and livelihoods, focusing on health literacy, access to healthcare, and providing training on leadership and on mental health awareness for the Somali women and girls. Well, to answer the question, refugees lack the basic legal means and necessities of life in Malaysia, such as opening bank account, driving cars, setting and managing their own businesses, getting marriage certificates and such. Most of the refugees are dependent on donor support in Malaysia. There is a donor fatigue due to systemic support for refugees, and people of power are silent, not setting up any long-term solutions or policy plan that allows refugees assist themselves. And so recently, when donors are willing to assist, they ask, what's the long-term plan for these people? If we help a month or two, what will happen next? And I think nothing can be changed for any help given to refugees, as it can't be something that will last forever until the right to work is approved. I've seen some advocacy programs lately on economic empowerment to provide basic needs for refugees. However, I think that remains ineffective, as of when refugees try to create a small job or small businesses, for instance, the law doesn't allow them to write their names on their businesses. So they are in hiding, running any sort of business while living in the country of asylum. What's more, speaking of refugee stakeholders, the community leaders are the ones who are always handle the burden as a primary focal point for their communities, trying harder to solve any problems, seeking ways of intervening the urgent cases before they shout out for help or do any referrals. However, we are not given any opportunities or good recognition or even empowerment to our work. There is no direct contribution that refugee stakeholders receive to manage to support their own refugees' family. who are suffering daily. Refugees are always micromanaged by NGOs or third-party contributions. So thriving is a country in a country of the asylum is a way beyond the fact. An example of that, when a refugee leader submit a proposal or ask for funding to INGOs or international or UNHCR even, in order to support their members, UNHCR prioritizes and prefer funding the other NGOs instead of training those refugee leaders who are tirelessly working and knows what's happening on the ground. They are even if they are less experienced in the process of paperwork, managing the project, they never they don't give that priority to fund them. Later, the NGOs that's funded comes to us, and they can't work without us, of course. And we do the most part of the project managing, and yet they don't allow us to pay any wage throughout the project period, which is so exploiting.
Thank you so much, Naima. I really appreciate your answer. And I think that you've said a few things. I mean, I had to stop and start writing a few things down because I thought that some of the things you said were really, really apt, particularly the statement you made regarding refugees hosting the burden of their own maintenance in exile and are not, while not being given any opportunities to advance. And the micromanagement that the refugee regime places on refugees. As well as the traditional structure within which we're all trying to function, which is one where the donors oftentimes will prioritize what they know rather than what's new and different and innovative, like capacity building for refugee-led organizations. Instead, there will often be established relationships which will get the priority. And these certainly grow over the time that a refugee population is in exile. And I'd like to turn to Tristan and ask, from the perspective of an academic, how you see and how you assess the impact of this dynamic of protraction over the long term and across contexts. Because you're working in Australia, but you've worked focusing on a lot of populations, and what you think needs to be done in order to ease or circumvent some of the challenges that refugee communities are facing. And if you don't mind saying just a few words about yourself as well.
Thanks, Temba. Well, it's a pleasure to join this conversation today. So I'm joining from Sydney, Australia, from the unceded land of the Darug and Darawal peoples based here in Australia. And I'm a researcher at the Cowdell Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And I'm also a consultant with Act for Peace. And I guess being based outside of the Southeast Asia region, I think some of my commentary today will more reflect on some of the kind of international trends, which I'm sure will have relevance to the region as well. So I guess broadly, two of the impacts we see is, first of all, that one is the displacement experienced by refugees is rarely temporary. Governments often like to suggest that the presence of refugees on their territories is only a temporary phenomenon. We see this rhetoric being played out in countries such as Bangladesh. We also see it in terms such as, in Southeast Asia context, reference to such states as transit countries, even though refugees often experience periods of extended exile in these countries. Even our international refugee law is similarly designed to apply for the period of time when the duration of risk exists. So it has inherently or implicitly some kind of temporariness embedded into it. Yet what we see with the absence of solutions provided to refugees has meant that refugees often find themselves stuck in protracted refugee situations for many years, if not generations. And problematically, this length in exile is increasing, not decreasing. The second major impact we see is that refugee displacement is being increasingly contained in developing countries in the global south. 15 years ago, 70% of refugees were hosted in developing countries. Now it is routinely more than 80 to 85%. And a large portion of those refugees reside in what are considered to be least developed countries. These are countries which have far less resources to actually support refugees, And obviously that has implications on the protection and rights refugees are able to access. Now, why has this occurred? This has occurred in part because of developing states' geographical proximity to refugee-producing countries, but it is also the deliberate efforts of richer states to prevent refugees from reaching and accessing asylum at their doors, whether it's by land, air or sea. This can be seen most notoriously in the interception of naval vessels, as is commonly practiced in countries such as Australia. It can be seen in the construction of border walls, but it also takes more subtler forms. For example, many countries geographically distant from refugee movements do not offer visas to persons from refugee-producing countries. And so this has huge implications, essentially closing off this option to take this regular migration pathway to reach safety. In terms of your question as to how do we address these issues, I think we need to emphasize that refugees produce benefits to host countries and are not just burdens. We need to produce a politics, both locally and internationally, that values protection of refugees, not protection from refugees. And although it is perhaps a long-term aspirational goal, we need to continue to build a more effective legal framework for responsibility sharing among states and other actors around the world. And this would include far more expansive integration of refugees in countries of asylum, as well as far more substantial increases to resettlement and other solutions. I'll leave it for there now. Thanks, Timber.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I can appreciate the way that you've used language to distill some really massive concepts into very easy to understand ideas. I mean, the line about shifting the way we view protection in particular towards protecting refugees rather than being protected from refugees, for example. And certainly the idea of underscoring the benefit of refugee populations in a hosting country. It's something that's so often obscured in a larger discourse. So I can really appreciate the comments that you've made there in terms of moving forward. The challenges, of course, are oftentimes in the details, and I'm sure that we'll get into those as we continue with session. But I'd like to move now to Humaira. And Humaira, I'm really glad you've been able to join. I apologize for any connection challenges you had earlier in the evening, but one of the great pleasures of being a moderator is that you get to learn about organizations such as Jakarta Bersatu, the organization that you've been working with. And as I was researching the organization, I was taken aback by the fact that in Bahasa Indonesia, Bersatu means to unite people, and that the organization is working to unite refugee populations with the host community in Indonesia. And it's very rare to find an NGO or an organization or a refugee-led community-based organization that's working on that interface between refugees and hosting populations. You'll often find organizations that focus solely on refugees. So I'm impressed by this and admit that I know not as much as I would like to about it. So I hope that in your introduction, you can say a few words about Jakarta Bersatu. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the opportunities that you see in long-term displacement situations for refugees and host communities to share the effort towards mutual acceptance, and what the challenges are that you face. And I'm also wondering if there's anything that you think has been left out of the discussion thus far about some of these long-term refugee situations. Humaira, we can't hear you yet.
Can you hear now?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Okay. I am Humaira from Afghanistan. I've been living in Indonesia since 2015 as a refugee. I am a former refugee educator a refugee advocate, and also I am the project manager of Jakarta Bersatu project, which I, along with my, some other refugee and non-refugee friends, co-founded on 2021. Jakarta Bersatu project is basically a livelihood opportunity for refugees by refugees. And we are targeting basically refugees, living in Jakarta and surrounding areas. Our goal is to make refugees able to at least, to help refugees to be able to at least cover the cost of their basic living needs, while waiting for resettlement and living in exile in the land of refuge. Basically, we provide livelihood training. So we started with a group of 12 refugee participants from Jakarta and surrounding areas, and they learned how to produce their own items, such as jewelries. And then our aim is to facilitate the marketing of the products that is made by refugees, so that we can sell them in online or offline local markets. And in this way we can make we can help refugees to make a small income in Indonesia. And yeah, also beside the training classes, we also provide Bahasa Indonesia classes, for the reason that we really understand how this interaction between refugees and the local community is important. I myself, as a refugee, I have been experiencing this misunderstanding that is between refugees and the local community, and then how it has been impacting refugees' life in Indonesia. We want to create collaboration between refugees and the local community through integration, through collaborating with local NGOs, companies, or organization, because we think it can help into narrowing the communication and cultural gap that currently exists between refugees and the local. And this also gives the local to have the understanding of refugee sufferings and plights and problems in Indonesia. In terms of the opportunities that the opportunities that is existing for a long term for refugees in Indonesia, and as well as the local community, I think we really need to start to stop thinking that refugees are a burden on the local community. Refugees are basically being labeled as poor, as illiterate, as burdensome, or as terrorist, which is unfairly wrong. Many refugees are highly skilled. They are talented, they are able, they have skills that they can offer to to the host country. And they can be a great asset to the host country if they are given this opportunity. For example, if I give an example of Jakarta Bersatu project, so some months ago we collaborated with a local company. So they offered our participants through one day of workshop to learn how to make soap, and in return our participants, they made soap for the local who do not have access to hygiene. So I think this is really great. This is amazing that we are not only receiving, but there is the opportunity for us where we can give back to the local community, or we are also in the process of making partnership with the Liberty Society. They help Jakarta Bersatu project in terms of giving facilities such as access to space, to sewing machines and all the other equipments needed for making clothes. And in return we help Liberty Society taking their orders and making their items for them. This is a great way of collaboration. And I think there are, if the opportunity is given, and if the refugees, the limitation and this restriction that they are facing right now, if that is kind of decreased and they are given the chance, refugees can be a great asset for the host community. One way, so myself, I think government of Indonesia really need to kind of lift up all the limitations that they have held for refugees in Indonesia, and they should give them the opportunity to participate and be a part of the local community. This is also, for example, possible through, if we see at the chances of internship. For example, refugees, they can be accepted into different companies, different NGOs, as an intern, someone who are trying to learn something. So this way they are not only receiving, they are giving, they are working in return. Or also right now, I mean, not only inside Indonesia, but if we think internationally, with the arrival of COVID-19, right now that, most of the things are being done online, I see this as a very potential chance for employment, because right now refugees, they do not need to travel outside of Indonesia to work for any company. Staying inside Indonesia, they can work for any company outside there. This connection, this network has to be made, and we need to work on that, because technology has made it very possible. And even if we talk about education, about higher education, okay, the problem was there that refugees, they cannot travel outside of Indonesia to go to any university and study through scholarship, but that is possible today with online learning. We have to give the refugees the opportunity. The universities, they have to be more generous to give this scholarship to refugees, so that they can also be included in their online learning, and they can learn while they are staying in Indonesia as a refugee. So there are a lot of potential, there are a lot of chances. We just need to work on them, and we need to bring that right network, that group of people, that right attention to these problems and the possible solution that is existing.
Thank you so much, Amira. I really appreciate how comprehensive your response was, and I wanted to stop at certain points and say, yes, that's the type of thing we need to be doing. And the first point where I felt that was hearing about Jakarta Bersatu, and looking at the effort, and looking at the initiative that started the effort, and the numbers. And the numbers aren't huge, it's looking at a few cases, but it's the conglomeration of efforts like that creates the wave that pushes the movement for refugee advocacy that I see. And I think that efforts like yours in Jakarta are precedent setting. They present examples for other parts of the globe, and that network that you're talking about building, absolutely essential in my view to advance these kinds of ideas and hear about projects like yours and like Naima's in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. So thank you so much for that. I just want to remind everybody that there will be a question and answer session at the end. So if you do have questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to drop them into the chat box, and we can make sure that they're attended to. But in the interest of time, I'm going to try and move a little bit more quickly. We did get a bit of a late start, and move on to our second talking point, which is discussion of the challenges that are faced in Southeast Asia, particularly, or globally, as the case may be, in terms of how to advance protection for refugees, effective, real protection for refugees. It doesn't just mean protection from refoulement, being sent back, but actual real substantive protection, including the basic fundamental rights that refugees are meant to be afforded. And as people on the call, many of you will already know, the international refugee regime has a really long history, but it's tied to Europe. And it's in this very specific geography and context of World War II, out of which the Refugee Convention was born. And this convention is really quite an incredible document in the breadth of rights that it provides. The problem is in the implementation. Where do those, what countries have obliged themselves to these, to uphold these rights? And for those that have not, are refugees effectively rightsless? So I would like to ask a little bit about the situation facing refugees in Southeast Asia, where the majority of the region has not obliged itself to the Refugee Convention and the provision of rights that it elaborates. And I'd like to start with Tristan as the legal scholar and researcher on refugee issues. If you could tell us a little bit about what the lack of a legal framework means in a practical sort of everyday sense for refugees, and what you see as the best option for refugees living in this kind of an environment.
Thanks, Temba. So yes, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees is an international treaty that establishes the definition of a refugee and articulates a number of rights for persons who meet that definition. Some of these rights include the right to work, the right to education, and then, as you say, there is also this central obligation in the Refugee Convention that is also found in international human rights law more broadly, which relates to non-refoulement. And this is the obligation not to return a person, any person, to any place where they may face persecution or other serious harm. It is true that Asia has few states party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. The Philippines, Japan, and Korea have ratified the convention, but countries in Southeast Asia, such as Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, have not done so. Now, if you look around the world, becoming party to the convention is not a guarantee that it will be complied with. For this reason, we need to be cautious when suggesting that becoming to the party to the convention is the right answer or is the answer. And really, as you say, implementation is key. Nevertheless, ratification, I think, is an important step. It's an indication of a willingness to afford refugees rights in countries of asylum and to engage with those rights systematically and transparently. Southeast Asian states have extended histories of engaging with refugees and providing refuge. And it is important that we do not overlook these contributions and assume or suggest that they have not taken place historically. Yet at the same time, the lack of the formalized legal framework in Southeast Asia has led to a situation of precariousness for many refugees in the region. Refugees often face insecurity and have limited access to education, healthcare, shelter, food, and water. Further, they're often prevented from legally working in countries of asylum due to restrictive national laws. These challenges to accessing protection, it should be pointed out, are often more severe for women, children, the elderly, LGBTQ communities, and refugees with disabilities. In terms of what should be done, I'm not in a position to advise refugees who may be listening what is the best option for them. These decisions really need to be made by refugees themselves, taking into account their own circumstances and priorities. I will note, however, that despite the clear structural restraints that many refugees experience, refugees are frequently exercising agency in as many ways they can. This can be seen in the protection responses refugees developed of their own accord, in which the other panelists have spoken about already. And it can also be seen in the pathways to solutions that they navigate through their own social, cultural, and migration capital. I'll stop there for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tristan. I appreciate very much your answer. I'd like to shift now to Humaira and recall something actually Tristan said earlier, which is that even the terms like transit country underscore an idea that the refugee a refugee displacement is a temporary phenomenon, and it's until someone moves on. That framing dismisses the fact that many refugees that have made Indonesia their home for decades, and nonetheless there have been a few advances in Indonesia. We can talk a little bit about the presidential regulation on the handling of foreign refugees, which is the first documentation to come out of that high level that recognizes the existence of refugees in Indonesia effectively. Implementation of protection, debatable in terms of how that's advancing things, but at least there is a recognition of refugees coming from the president's office. Indonesia continues to lack that protection mechanism and those tools for assistance. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see among the refugee populations that you work with as the greatest challenges when living in a country without the frameworks that are in place to protect refugees.
Okay, so Thimba, the greatest challenge for refugees for now is, I think, the lack of resettlement. We know that there are thousands of refugees around the world only 1% of these refugees, they get the chance to get resettled, and the rest they do not. And this leads refugees to living in uncertainty for a very long time in the in exile in the transit country. For refugees in Indonesia too, the greatest challenges of refugees have been living in uncertainty for a very long time. We have refugees who who are stuck in Indonesia, and they have been living here since 2010, even 2011. They've been living here for more than 10 years, and that also without having access to their most fundamental human rights, such as the right to work or the right to study. It is very, very challenging for refugees to survive living in a country where you do not have your basic human rights. You cannot work. If you do not work, how do you feed yourself? How do you fulfill your basic needs? And this living in uncertainty has it has impacted refugees' mental health, and it has created health problems. Refugees, they are living in depression. They are they have anxiety. We have been we have more than 9 suicide case since last year. More than 9 refugees, they have committed suicide in Indonesia since last year. And the biggest reason is, of course, the uncertainty itself, the long wait, living in Indonesia for, a very long time, and they even do not know until when, while they have their, their families, their loved ones in, back in Afghanistan, in their country. If we talk about the current situation, especially now, we know that a lot of refugees, many refugees in Indonesia, they are from Afghanistan. And right now, the situation of refugees in Indonesia is, it's even much more challenging for us. We are even pretty much more occupied than we have ever been, because we all have, our loved ones, our family left in Afghanistan, in the hand of Taliban. And it also, gives us mental health issues. We are sad, we are heartbroken, and we are left helpless in the land of refuge without any option. We cannot help our families back in Afghanistan. That is, I think one of the biggest challenges that refugees, especially refugees from Afghanistan, let's say, they are going through right now. And yeah, part of that, again, the lack of livelihood itself is, I think, one of the other greatest challenges for refugees. Not all refugees, they are being supported by NGOs such as CRS, CWS, or IOM. There are just a few number of refugees who are being supported, and then we have other refugees who are living independently, and then they do not have access to any livelihood. So again, it's a very big challenge for them, and then it creates and causes other challenges, such as, again, mental health issues. And of course, another thing is also the lack of having access to higher education. So refugees, we ourselves, we took the lead and the initiative. We built these learning centers for our kids, but it only provides basic education to kids. But people like myself, who we are in our productive age, we do not have access to higher education. And some of the refugees, they are doing this GED program to just have their high school certificate, and after the graduation, again, they are left without any option, because they do have their high school certificate, but again, the chance of continuing and for higher education is lacking there. These are, one of the greatest challenges that refugees in Indonesia, they are right now going through.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I know that the situation in Indonesia is particularly difficult, as is the situation in Malaysia. So I'd like to shift to Naima and to ask really the same question that I put to Humaira, and that is that we've seen a lot of hope with Malaysia over the course of a couple of sequential governments now, that the situation might change for refugees for the better, and then for the worse, and then for the better. And then we saw the horrific response to populations that were seeking asylum or other protection in Malaysia, particularly the Rohingya at the advent of COVID and the situation with the boats that were refused disembarkation and the popular xenophobic rhetoric that started to go through Malaysia. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, looking at the fact that we have a long way to go and sequential governments can really shift the dynamic of a country. If you could talk a little bit about how to progress a movement in a context that does have so many variables that are shifting all of the time, and how you've been able through your work to maintain a focus through all of those shifts and changes.
Thank you. I would say that UNHCR never get tired of registering those asylum seekers, but the fact that they are the most vulnerable. And when it comes to protection, they are seen as undocumented. I mean, the entire refugees are recognized as illegal immigrants, but when it comes to protection, sometimes you see women suffering domestic violence or facing sexual assault. So these members are even unable to lodge a report because they fear that they could be arrested by the authority. So it has been a very difficult to for the entire refugee community in Malaysia when the resettlement became less than 1%, for example, and especially for the women and children, it was a real challenge and a struggle to continue to live in Malaysia. So speaking for my community, for instance, when the resettlement rate has decreased, some chose to retain their country of origin, while others couldn't afford a plane ticket. So there is a lot of talk about refugees and it is advocacy programs lately, but the question is how this could be achieved without rights approved. There's no long-term plan to encourage the refugee community in Malaysia, and there's no arrangements that will make it easier for them to stay in Malaysia for a long time. The rest who don't have other options, for example, are the ones who remain suffering here and often ask for support from NGOs and UNHCR. We have, for example, uneducated refugee women, girls, and children who are vulnerable. For example, throughout this COVID season, the living situation turned even worse due to the house evictions, mental health problems, and being unable to pay their rentals and basics. Some single women are at risk, for example, of any forms of violation and abuses from perpetrators, for they don't have a permanent housing. They locate from house to house, begging the families to shelter them a day or two and life goes on like that. So there are very few NGOs who help those cases in the daily basis. However, so we wanted to see more that UNHCR does as a COVID response plan for refugees, which is not much happening. So we would like to see that refugees being included in the policy making, for example, in the Global Refugee Forum. So instead of those people, non-refugee activists or politicians who never face the sort of trauma, displacement, torture that the refugees and asylum seekers are already facing, those people, I would say, they can probably represent refugees as a first line policy setting solution when it comes to policy making for the refugees. And when we want to seek a solution for a victim, I think they should be asked what they think of the solution. They may even share more on what other things happening on the ground when they think their problems could be solved and such. So speaking of how the refugee able to, for example, navigate whenever there is a hatred and xenophobic speech around. I remember some of our Rohingya friends have been hunted down by some members because of they have spoken out loud about the government actions and policies and all that. So most of the refugees are unable to speak out loud about the actions or whatever xenophobic or hatred speech going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naima. I salute the work that you're doing in Malaysia, especially under the circumstances that you're dealing with there. And you and Humaira before you have both highlighted two, I think, aspects of response that are much too often overlooked. And those are the situation of risk facing women and girls across the board. You have to remember that a refugee population is, of course, a cross section of any population. So it is going to have vulnerable people within it. And it's a powered relationship and an exploitative one, and one where people are often at risk. And when those risks are realized, do not have recourse to seek accountability for the circumstances that they've been put in. So that's one. Is the particular situation facing women and girls. The other that Humaira mentioned, and it's one that I think is similarly often overlooked or somehow swept to the side, is the critical issue of mental health and how refugees are expected to continue to live in environments that are incredibly challenging to mental health. The situation facing Afghans in particular right now that Humaira mentioned is unbelievably taxing. And we do see not only in Indonesia and Malaysia, but all over the world, refugee suicides, the numbers are extremely high. Depression, anxiety, any number of situations that really present challenges to refugees, and then present challenges for refugees seeking their protection because they are not in a position to be able to effectively present their circumstance due to the effects of that mental health strain. So those are two things, and you're both advocating in different ways, Naima and Myra, about these some of the different issues that you've seen and some of the specific challenges to population. So to move to talking point number 3, I want to move us a little bit into how refugees can influence policy. And as noted, without rights, refugees are effectively invisible actors in a legal sense, without recognition. So basically, we've seen refugees be sidelined for years in policy discussions. But in recent years, we've seen, particularly in Asia and the Pacific, the building of a movement led by refugees, determined by refugees, funded by the efforts of refugees, really shifting the dialogue. And it's not tokenistic. It's very much a movement that says we, in solidarity as refugees around the globe or as refugees in this region, want to see change. Nothing about us without us, the famous slogan coming out of the refugee advocacy movement. And we want to see it with us in the room, as decision makers, as idea generators. And that goes to your point about asking people who've been, Naima, it goes to your point about asking people who've been through the circumstances what they think of the solutions that are being provided to them. So I want to talk a little bit about refugee-based and refugee-led advocacy. I come from a position of working in NGOs and working in organizations that traditionally have been guilty of sidelining refugees. And I saw the progression of my previous organization through the development of policy within the organization to try and increase the access that refugees have. But I don't think that that's moving fast enough. And so what I'd like to do is ask you, Humaira and Naima, if you could talk a little bit about the refugee communities that you work with, particularly as regards engaging in advocacy and some of the challenges there, because there is a balance of risk. If refugees stick their heads up and protest, they could be detained, they could be deemed to be troublemakers and risk their service provision support. They could be arrested, they could be deported. But if they don't, the situation continues as it has, progressively getting worse and worse. And so there's a real challenge there. And I'm wondering if you could talk, each of you, a little bit about the populations that you work with and how they see the future of a refugee-led movement and what avenues they see, because those of us working in traditional NGOs are likely blind to those, and those perspectives will be coming from refugee communities. So I'd like to start with you, Naima, and then maybe you, Humaira, if that's all right.
Thank you, Themba. Yeah, first of all, I think refugee leaders need refugee community. The refugee-led organizations. They need to be recognized. That international community should recognize refugee-led organizations, and also and the banking policy that's supportive to the refugee to be self-sustaining, and also to be able to not only finance themselves, but also to finance the other lives of the refugees and their determinants of life. Also, I think we like to see that there should be international support that allows refugee legally, for example, they receive the right to work, for example, and I think after receiving the right to work, things will get easier to solve, and refugees will be able to finance their health and housing and everything that basically that refugee needs. Also, we will need an international community to highlight this potential and contribution for refugees to fight the hate and xenophobic, especially from the power and the heart that runs the country. There should be also an expedition of the resettlement of, for example, the women at risk, children, elderly, and also disabled people. We also need to see that there should be opportunities for higher education, because we have seen that the community-led organizations are the ones who are always working and know what's happening on the ground with their refugee members. So there should be like a higher education so that these people know to manage their community centers best. And we would also like to see scaling up the women leadership, because we have seen that, for example, speaking of my community, there's like 65% are women, girls. So that very enormous percentage we have in the community. I think they are the building block of the community, those women and girls, and most of them are illiterate. So for the ones who have, for example, higher education, they still need a capacity building, and they need to postgraduate studies, for example, or how to work or set up with the and with an NGOs, or work with the NGOs past. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naima. I appreciate that. And I'm wondering, Humaira, if you have anything to add from your experience, particularly around how refugee populations and refugee leaders can really be informing the movement for a much more inclusive refugee process.
Mm-hmm. Themba, first, when we talk about refugee, refugee advocacy inside Indonesia for refugees, it has been always, very challenging. For instance, if we talk about, some of the protests that these refugees, they have formed, in front of UNHCR office for their right. For example, one of the protests that refugees did, it was on 24th of August. Refugees, they face challenges in terms of being accepted, and in terms of they face problems from the officials. Refugees, they have been arrested, they have been detained because they have been protesting, and they have been released back. And when the people, they say that these refugees, they say that we have problems inside Indonesia that we need to issue. And the kind of responses that they have, they hear from the official is that if you're not happy in Indonesia, why don't you go back to your country? This is the kind of response people they hear. And even if they raise their voice, if they gather for a protest, they are being detained. And then the officials, they ask the people to go away, and even they sometimes they get violent. We have we have witnesses, we have the evidence. It's never easy. And the other thing, when we talk about the advocacy that is formed or that is led by refugees, I really think that refugee leadership itself, it needs to be supported. And I think that refugees' participation in the global refugee regime should be considered. We really need to bring refugees in front desk, and along with the other strong voices, they need to raise their voice for and make decision for themselves. And we need to recognize this, and we need to give more focus to that. And I think this way it would be more safer than just gathering and going in front of UNHCR and asking for your right, because then you have to face the law and you have to face the official. And one another problem right now that is going inside the refugee community itself is that the fear that people they have inside them of how doing advocacy can raise the chances of resettlement for them. For example, refugees right now, they are pretty much scared of even having access to some of the facilities. They have been even negotiating about the learning centers and the sports and all the other facilities that we have inside Indonesia for them. The refugees think that this might cause the lack of resettlement for them, and this might cause UNHCR to shift their focus from refugees inside Indonesia, and they should prioritize other refugees outside Indonesia. I think that's one of the biggest challenge that right now it's going on, because refugees, they of course they do want to do the advocacy for their rights, but they are very, very scared that how this will impact their life, and especially the resettlement process for them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that these are really critical perspectives, and I'd like to turn it now to Tristan. And Tristan, I know you through work around refugee participation and the efforts that you've put in the past through affiliations with Act for Peace or with Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network or with others to discuss things like the Global Refugee Forum and how to advance advocacy through those larger policy structures, global policy structures. And so I'm wondering if you could, for the benefit of the people who are on the call, just talk a little bit about where we are now in terms of the we being the non-refugee advocacy contingent, where we are now and where we came from and where we need to be as non-refugees. To ensure that refugee participation is real, it's substantial, it's substantive, it's informed, and it's effective. And if you have insights from the work that you've been doing on what has and has not worked in that regard, as pertains to NGOs and policymakers for providing that space for refugees to fill.
Thanks, Temba. Yes, this is a topic that's close to my heart, and I'll try and answer those questions as quickly as possible while there are a lot of them. So just starting with the history a little bit, it is often assumed that refugees were largely excluded from decision-making processes in the development of early international refugee law and policy. However, this is not really and entirely the case. For example, the idea of creating a binding international treaty with respect to refugees was first proposed by refugee Jacques Rubenstein in 1927 on behalf of what you would now consider to be a refugee-led organisation. The first High Commissioner of UNHCR had lived experience of displacement, something that hasn't been repeated since with any other subsequent High Commissioners of UNHCR. We also saw several staff members with inside UNHCR in the 1950s having lived experience of displacement. Now, since this early history, the refugees have largely been excluded from decision-making processes that affect them. And I think there's a transition away from this. In that period of growth of the humanitarian regime, as well as the movement of refugees away from Europe to other parts of the world. And so by governments, donors and humanitarians alike, refugees have been seen as helpless, passive victims, rather than actors of change in their own right. And what you're referring to is, I think, the witnessing of a new emergence of advocacy by refugees, advocating for their inclusion in decision-making processes at all levels of governance. This has already had some impact. It has led to the formation of new regional and international refugee-led networks, such as the Global Refugee-Led Network. And it has also led to the acknowledgement in international law that refugees should be included in decision-making responses that affect them, particularly in the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees, which states committed to in 2018. This work, however, I think I'll speak optimistically, is still in transition, but we see systemic failures to ensure participation in practice. In particular, when we get down to the nitty-gritty of different decision-making areas, such as law and policy making, deliberations on durable solutions, and program and service delivery on the ground, we still see refugees often excluded from these decision-making processes. For example, among the 31 tripartite agreements that have been signed since 1996 for the voluntary repatriation of refugees to their country of origins, these have all been made by the country of origin, the country of refuge, and UNHCR, with no refugee-led organisation being included as a stakeholder in these processes, and very little consultation with refugees in these processes as well. Similarly, in resettlement, both at an individual level and at a group level, we see widespread exclusion of refugees in these processes. Refugees can often attest to that they rarely know when they're being considered for resettlement at an individual level. If they are considered for resettlement, they then rarely have a say in where they'll be resettled. And beyond that, in the development of resettlement policy at the international level, there has been widespread exclusion of refugees in these processes as well. So the development of UNHCR's resettlement handbook, the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement have often excluded refugees. However, there have been some small gains in this in recent years, particularly since 2019 onwards. Non-refugee advocates, I think, have a substantial role to play in this, particularly in working in collaboration with these refugee-led organisations and networks to enhance meaningful refugee participation. And I think, as Humaira and Naima commented on this call, this is something that's actively sought from refugee-led organisations on the ground. Additionally, I think we also all have an obligation to interrogate whether our legal and policy frameworks are sufficient for ensuring the meaningful participation of refugees across these range of decision-making scenarios. When we can compare the international refugee regime to the consultative frameworks of other rights regimes, such as those related to Indigenous peoples or persons with disabilities, it is clear that more could be done in this space. And finally, I think we all need, the non-refugee advocates also need to keep in check our own privileges and biases and reflect on them constantly. We all have an obligation to address and overcome systems of oppression. Thank you.
Excellent, an excellent recap of where we are now and how we got there. And something I find very, very interesting about that response is that it does situate refugee participation within that larger context. And I do think that one of the things that we often overlook is that the fact that refugees have been advocating for themselves since the existence of refugees. And it's the fault of others not allowing for that space or shutting that space down actively. that has so often led towards such exclusive circumstances for refugees, and the understanding that a lot of these ideas were coming out, at least in the formation of refugee law, from refugees themselves, or efforts by refugee-led organizations, although they weren't termed that at the time, is really poignant in this, to demonstrate that this is part of a much larger movement, and that we're now facing a new shift in that, and a new visibility in that. And that movement is moving us forward. And that brings me to our fourth and final talking point, which is moving forward. And I think we've covered a lot of the questions that I have here around moving forward. So I don't think we'll need to spend a whole lot of time on this section, and I think that the time would be preferentially applied, at least in my behalf, towards a question and answer session, and make sure that participants have the opportunity to put some questions to the panelists. I've seen some already coming into the chat. If you do have questions, please put them in there, and we'll do our best to answer them before we're out of time today. But basically, I'd like to take these remaining minutes before the Q&A to discuss what kind of reform is really needed. We've heard a couple of examples: right to work, effective legal frameworks for protection, these types of things, the growing of the refugee-led movement. But from the perspective of both refugees and non-refugees, and I appreciate the balance that we have on this panel, how do we achieve that core mission of refugee protection in Southeast Asia specifically? And I'd like to hear first from Naima and Humaira, just one or two sentences of what needs to happen now regarding the context that you're in, and then from Tristan, again, just one or two sentences of what you would like to see, what you think would be a real shift in the coming years in refugee protection in the coming in the region. Maybe Humaira, if you could go first.
Okay. One thing that I've been thinking about is, that can be a solution for refugees, while they are waiting for resettlement, is that the government of Indonesia, should consider issuing refugee temporary stay permit cards to refugees while they are living in transit country, because these could solve a lot of issues that refugees, they have right now. This temporary card is taken, help refugees to work inside Indonesia and to have access to their most, many of the rights that they don't have access right now. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think right now there are, the chances or the possibilities are a lot there. As I said, if you are talking about employment, today employment is very much possible with technology. Why the global companies, global businesses, they don't consider refugees, employ refugees as their employee. And as well as if we talk about education, again, today it is possible through online learning. Refugees, while they are living as a refugee inside the transit country, they can still study in any part of the world through the scholarship. I think for now, these are some of the solutions that we can work towards and we can consider as a solution for refugees.
Excellent, thank you so much, Humaira. Naima, do you have a few senses of what you think need to be priority focus areas moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have too much positivity in Malaysia that unless one rights for refugee recognized, because as educated refugees we are struggling to receive some income, but it's still very challenging for us. And what we can do is being a translator, doing some interpretation for the NGOs. Even UNHCR doesn't hire the refugees, except the stateless community members. So we can, foretell what the other uneducated refugee members are going through, and how they will be their lives for the coming years. So I would say there should be expedition of resettlement. Because some educated refugees or refugees with capacity can still have some opportunities to go to the third country, as long as the country of asylum is not trying us to or recognizing that we can contribute to the country. So we have some people with some members who have relatives, for example, in overseas, so they don't know the real process. So there is a less of cooperation between UNHCR because they don't provide lawyers and the sponsor and the refugee community members. So because I think the pattern will at least be easy, and so many refugees will get resettled if that's being expedited. And the very less university accept refugees also a scholarship, but they still require visa, which the refugee members can't afford to pay themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naima. And Tristan, from your perspective as someone who's really been working on the larger picture in terms of policy and in terms of engagement at a regional and global level, what would you like to see in terms of advancing the situation facing refugees in Southeast Asia in the coming few years?
Thanks, Temba. Yes, I guess from the international perspective, we need to recognize that the international refugee regime is failing to meet its core objective to providing protection to people in need. When I reflect on the kind of title of this session, looking at beyond resettlement, I still believe that so long as we have international borders and sovereign jurisdictions, the three durable solutions of resettlement, local integration, and voluntary repatriation to the country of origin in conditions of safety and dignity are still relevant and will continue always have a role to play in the future of the refugee regime. Nevertheless, there are other options that can be pursued in addition to these. As mentioned in the comments about complementary pathways to protection through education, through work visas, etc. These are important as well. We need to address the nexus between refugees and migration more thoroughly to look at other opportunities for movement with increased mobility. And then on the ground, I think we need to support refugee-led organisations with their work. We need to support refugees in their advocacy. We need to also address the political and socio-cultural aspects of refuge to counter xenophobia, for example, and to highlight the potential of displaced populations. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tristan. I very much appreciate that. We've now come to the end of the talking points. We've heard a tremendous variety of points made, not only on the particular circumstances facing refugees in Indonesia and Malaysia, but also the region and the world, and how we might be able to move forward, advancing from some of the challenges that we've heard about. So I can really appreciate the breadth of this conversation. But I also appreciate, how a lot of these challenges are challenges we've heard before. And a lot of these opportunities are opportunities that we continue to talk about and struggle to advance. But I do want to close the formal part of this panel by saying that it's through this continued effort, while it may seem glacial in speed at some points, where we might see a sudden advance somewhere else, it's through that maintained initiative at the very local level, at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level, and at the personal level. So I really appreciate the three of you for joining this panel. And I appreciate, of course, the hosts of the conference for inviting me to be a part of this. We have not a whole lot of time, but we are hoping to extend, if people are willing to stay, for another 10 or 15 minutes. And I'd like to make sure that we have at least 3 questions answered, one for each of the panelists. So we're certainly willing to keep taking questions, and panelists, please do take a look at the chat. If there's a question to you in there, feel free to answer it there, just in the circumstance that we don't have enough time to answer it verbally. But the first one I'd like to direct to Humaira. It's the first question that came in. And it says, Sister Humaira, based on your experience with Jakarta Bersatu, how do you navigate the uncertainty regarding right to work, and what kind of challenge do you face due to the situation, the legal situation around rights to work?
Thank you, Dia, for your question. Okay, if I again specifically talk about uncertainty when it comes to having, you know, the right to work in Indonesia. Of course, it has always been very challenging, and it is still challenging, even for you know, for an organization like Jakarta Bersatu Project. We have to be really careful with what we are doing, so that we do not, you know, risk the, you know, violate the laws of Indonesia, or we do not put our participants in any risk. We have been trying, you know, for I think more than 6 months, trying to just, you know, register Jakarta Bersatu Project officially inside Indonesia, and that has been very challenging. We are still on hold and still trying to explore, you know, the possibilities. You know, refugees who inside Indonesia who are trying to have, you know, kind of independent business, they have been, you know, detained. They have been caught by the immigration, and they have put into the into prison, into jail, because of doing business inside Indonesia. Those are, you know, the kind of risk that we are facing. And regarding what we are doing, I think for refugees, for now, until there is no, you know, until there are any changes made into Indonesian government's policy towards refugees, the safest way for us is, you know, helping refugees through refugee-led, through refugee-based projects, rather than, you know, refugees having independent businesses like opening a shop that can just, you know, put them into detention center. So we know that we right now, for example, we cannot support refugees as official, you know, businessmen or official people who has their own business, but we are trying to find the safe, you know, safe way for them, where they can practice their skills, and then using their ability and skill, they can, you know, earn an income. And we are making that, you know, possible through, of course, again, our collaboration with, you know, local companies, local NGOs, and organization. Being partnered with local organization for now, I think, is one of, you know, the safest ways for now for refugees to work on livelihood, and to kind of be an answer to, you know, uncertainty of, you know, having access to livelihood and being able to have an income right now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I just want to quickly note that I've had a message that Naima has had to leave the session for other meetings. So I'm saddened that we can't get to some of the questions that are directed to Naima, but I'm sure that we'll be able to follow up if people have very specifics that they'd like to know about the work that she's doing, the organization that she's a part of, context within which she does that work. So I guess in that case, I'll move on to Tristan and a question that's come in for you, Tristan, from Jean. To Tristan Hartley. In the context of building an inclusive society or governance, what type of activities or potential ways to have refugees involved in the decision-making process, particularly on the decisions that have a direct impact on them? What avenues do you see is how I read this question? What are the potential ways to get those refugees involved in those rooms, being part of those decisions?
Thanks, Temba. So I guess this is a question that needs to be addressed holistically. And one of the ways that I think we should do that is by considering all the decision-making areas where refugees should have a say in the decision-making processes. And I would argue that they are all decisions which materially impact upon the human rights of refugees. Now, in terms of types, that could take a variety of forms. It would include explore and policy making at the international, the national, the local level. It would include participation in durable solutions, but also in other relocation decisions. That's where decisions where refugees are transferred from one jurisdiction to another. They often occur on a less than durable basis. For example, when refugees are moved from, say, Australia to other countries for offshore processing, this is also occurring in Europe. And a third area of decision making that I think is really important is the participation of refugees in program and service delivery on the ground. And that could be a whole range of activities, whether it's relating to health, education, economic opportunities and entrepreneurial activities. In terms of supporting refugees to be able to participate, that once again needs to take a variety of forms. We need to obviously dedicate funds to the task and recognise that just asking refugees to voluntarily do so is ethically problematic, but also it's unlikely to lead to the outcomes that the regime needs to see. Often one of the barriers to participation that refugees experience is they'll receive criticisms that their participation is not representative enough. Even though, for example, I may not be, questioned as to kind of, from whose perspective I'm speaking on, in the various fora that I may speak in. But it is a criticism that is often labelled against refugees and refugee-led organisations quite problematically. And I'd say it's particularly problematic because external stakeholders really support the enabling of representative bodies within refugee communities. There's a general blanket, dismissal or a lack of willingness to support the political agency of refugees. You see in international instruments a willingness to some extent to support the economic potential of refugees, which is often framed within ideas of self-reliance. But when it comes to the political agencies of refugees, that's often cast aside or overlooked or just not discussed at all. So even in the Refugee Convention, there is very little that mentions the political rights of refugees. Even when we look at solutions, resettlement is seen as a great solution. But when you look at the way it's defined by UNHCR, it leads to an outcome of permanent residence, but not necessarily citizenship in all examples. And yet citizenship is really the only way to restore the political rights of refugees in third countries. So there's numerous barriers there that we need to address holistically.
Thank you so much for that. You've touched on citizenship there at the end, and the idea of advancing enjoyment of those fundamental human rights holistically, shifting from refugee-specific rights to fundamental human rights. There's a discussion that you've referenced, Tristan, in the chat about how to advance refugees. I'll omit the word protection because I think that there are some challenges in this. Through alternate means, complementary pathways, humanitarian visas, in the absence of opportunities for resettlement, and in the absence, sometimes willful, policy-based resistance to allowing for integration. And of course, given the situation that a lot of refugees face with a maintained risk, keeping the idea of repatriation from becoming a realistic option. What can civil society, NGOs and individuals do to push forward some of these alternate paths? And what do you see, Tristan, as some of the potential problematics of those paths? And Humaira, if you have anything to add, of course, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential in relation to exploring complementary pathways to protection. Indeed, with the absence of the traditional durable solutions available to most refugees around the world, this is an alternative way where potentially there may be solutions which otherwise would not exist. So we need to put, dedicate attention towards addressing that. One of the models that often gets considered as a positive framework is looking at community sponsorship. So this is a model that's emerged particularly in Canada, but there's examples in other parts of the world as well. And this is where the community can participate in supporting the resettlement of refugees to third countries. It's been shown to have positive influences in building community support for refugees within that particular place and countering xenophobia. And I guess in terms of the problematics that you talk about, there is also that question, and I think even in such a positive scheme like community sponsorship, where we need to consider the language there and consider whether the process itself has been truly consultative with refugees involved in that process as well. So to what extent do refugees support the idea of being sponsored, and the label sponsorship, for example? I think we need to reflect upon this. But yes, broadly, I think we need to consider complementary pathways, but we also need to take stock that they should not necessarily replace the traditional durable solutions. States have a fundamental obligation to support refugees seeking asylum in their countries of asylum, and so that needs to be supported, and we need to advocate for those work rights and education rights in those countries, and not just suggest that there'll be alternative pathways as well. So it's a complex mixture of solutions that needs to be employed.
Thank you so much, and I can certainly appreciate the number of challenges ahead, but also the opportunities. It's been an absolute pleasure to have the three of you on the panel today. We're coming to a close. I apologize that we haven't been able to get through to all of the questions that are in the chat. Please feel free to continue to put questions in there. Panelists, please feel free to continue to respond there if you're so inclined. I've seen a note from the organizers that there is a feedback form that they're hoping people will fill out. There's a link in the chat. But I would just like to say again, thank you so much to Tristan, Humaira, and Naima for being here and bringing such valuable perspectives to this discussion. I'd like to thank Siko, who's worked really hard in the background to make sure that this happens. And I'd like to thank all of you, the participants, for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Siko.
Thank you, Themba. So yes, like Themba said, we are coming to our end of the session. I would like again, thank you to our esteemed speaker, Sister Humaira, Tristan, and Sister Naima, who already left us for another appointment. And also for Themba for excellent moderating. I would say high appreciation for all of you. So just a little bit closing remarks that we are still going to have another session today. Please visit our conference website at 1 o'clock. We are going to have a thematic session, part 2, space and place in the everyday life of the refugees and host communities. So please also attend the session and register for it. And also we will have what you call the event recap on our social media. So if you miss this session, you can see the event recap there, and also we will be posting the session on our YouTube channel. So that being said, thank you so much for participating in this event. Thank you so much for your questions and appreciation. So we will see you in another occasion. Thank you so much. Mbak Aquino, Mbak Tessa.
Ya, masih kok.
Yeah.
Saya nyalain ini ya.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's all of the participants already left. Yeah, again, so Temba, Tristan, Humaira. So I would just again say thank you and appreciation for all of you to attend. Being a very resourceful speaker, and also share the your experience and your views on the said topic. So I would just like to introduce Mbak Aquino as the director of the conference. Mbak Aquino.
That's very kind of you to say that. But yeah, I just would like to personally thank you very much for agreeing to join us in this conference as moderator and panelist. I mean, we haven't really connected before, but I mean, we've heard all about you from Maziko, and that was a really interesting and very insightful panel discussion. And I hope we can still work together in the future for taking this a bit more the discussion a bit more. So yeah, thank you so much. And Temba, I know you're in the US right now, so it must be really late for you, so thank you so much for for your time. And Humaira, hi. We have a question for you, Humaira, because your background was really intriguing. I mean, the beach background was really like very real. So we were thinking, like, are you in an actual beach or something?
Actually, if you bring
I brought
pineapple
the
around,
beach in
it'll
my
be
home.
convincing. Pineapple or
Yeah, we discussed that in our urban refugees group. Like, did you see Humaira's background? It's so real. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much for today. So Masiko, back to you.
Yeah. Okay, so I will not hold you guys any longer. We will stay in touch with Temba, Tristan, Humaira, and also Sister Naima. And yeah, so far it's that. Unless Mbak Tessa, do you have any other notes for the speaker and moderator?
No, I think you've mentioned it all.
Okay.
Just glad to see you.
Yeah. Thank you all. So have a great day.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Great day. Thank you. Bye.
So much.
Really a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Hah? Ini aku postnya.
Nah, lo. Udah ya. Bon, aman,
Oke.
Bon. Oh, udah keluar.
Oke.
Oke, Mbak. Thank you.
Ya.
Berarti nanti yang technicalities buat itu nggak ada ya, maksudnya yang untuk Tristan ya I don't know, support bla 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 gitu.
Support untuk gimana?
Financial support.
Ada. Nanti ada kok, Mas. Nanti itu kita hubungin sekalian, kita ngasih pertanyaan, kita ngasih pertanyaan yang belum terjawab juga.
Oh, untuk mereka address verbally ya. Oke.
Jadi,
Verbally maksudnya secara tulisan.
Tertulis. Jadi minta mereka jawaban sambil nanti aku bakal ngirimin kayak semacam apa ya, invoice gitu lah.
Ini another technicalities kayak embel-embel sertifikat tuh akan ada nggak sih?
Ada.
Oh, ada. Oke.
Paling minta tolong Masiko kirim thank you note sementara dulu dari Masikonya gitu.
Oh ya, nanti aku kirim ke mereka. Oke.
Okay.
Sip, nanti berarti aku boleh mencatut nama Mbak Tessa atau nanti maksudnya embel-embelnya kayak nanti akan ada rekan dari FDUMC yang kontak kalian.
Bilangnya cuma kontak untuk follow up aja, nggak usah bilang follow up-nya apa gitu.
Oh iya, of course. Thank you Mbak Tessa. Sip.
Terima kasih, Mas.
Yo. Mbak Tessa, satu lagi.
Ya.
Si Gather Town tuh masih aktif kan maksudnya?
Masih.
Oke. Ya berarti aku nanti coba nongkrong juga di situ.
Oke. Sip.
Oke, thank you. Yo.